Hello and welcome to 2021 and a new season of My Virtual Jericho. We've done 35 in 2020. We've got a lot more scheduled for this year. Today, the pandemic is still very firmly with us. We're all in lockdown and we will be for several months to come. Today's guest is one of Jericho's more prominent residents, Professor Jim Naismith, who is not only a Jericho resident, but also the Professor of Structural Biology at Oxford and the Director of the Rosalind Franklin Institute. He is much quoted on the pandemic. If you read the Daily Mirror today, or indeed the Metro, or indeed the Daily Mail, quite often you'll see him quoted on the pandemic. Jim, give us your views on the current state of play on the pandemic.
So I hasten to add, they extract small bits of my quotes from the Science Media Centre. My own expertise is structural biology, and we've been really interested in ways to block the virus infecting the cell. And in fact, work from the Franklin shows that we can actually make molecules that do that. But where I've played, or the comments that have been quoted, are usually around simple mathematics or around numbers. The Science Media Centre has asked scientists to try to contribute factual or at least reasonable analysis, because otherwise it's very difficult for journalists to get their head around what numbers mean. And so one of the things that's problematic is that we have a fairly good estimate of, if you have about 1,000 people infected, between 5 to 8 of them will die, and as many as 20, maybe even as high as 30 to 40 will be hospitalized. And those all happen in different time frames. So you get infected, you don't get a positive test, usually for at least 2 or 3 days till the virus builds up. People then become sick or not. Most people don't even know they've got the disease. This is one of the difficulties of it. But those small numbers who do become ill usually become ill about 10 days after infection and can end up in hospital. And it's always this delaying that's the hard bit. Because of course, whenever we see some item in the news that there are 60,000 positive tests, it's very hard for people to know what that really means. Because, you know, were all these people randomly selected? Were they the people with the highest viral loads? Were they the people with most sick? And during sort of September to October, we blundered into this belief that because we weren't seeing a lot of infections that the virus had gone away. But when you looked at the ONS survey detail, now that's different than the number of people who are tested and test positive. So the ONS survey samples, and this is done in collaboration with people in Oxford, it samples random sets of the population, a random set of the population. And it's a really good way to measure viral spread in the country. And that's really the best measure or best estimate of the number of people that are infected. And what we saw as we went through October was that the daily numbers were sort of static, but the ONS survey data was showing that there was a much faster spread of infection than had been seen. And this is just a defect, or was a defect in the testing system. And this mismatch between the number of people infected and the number of people testing positive is why track and trace fails in this country. So usually my comments to the media are around trying to get them to understand the difference between the various numbers. And so one of the problems is that you can be accurate or you can be timely. So in a fast-moving pandemic, it really matters having information immediately, but the problem with having information immediately is it's not very accurate. And so it's trying to get journalists to try to see and look at different sources and try to make sense of what those numbers will mean. So I've always stayed away from policy advocacy. So I'm not here to give up. I think that has to be for politicians to do. But I think I see my role, if there is a role for people like me, is to give some form of make them look as a scientist would at how these different numbers interact and what they mean. The key problem for coronavirus is decisions have to be made very quickly. So, for example, we are now in the third lockdown. Had we not been in the third lockdown by now, and the virus had continued to spread at the rate it was doing, which looked like it was close to doubling every 2 weeks, 10 days, then we would really be in very, very serious difficulty.
So if you were advising the Prime Minister directly, you would advise him to go into the third lockdown?
So I think that the key thing for people like me to advise the Prime Minister is what the numbers mean. The Prime Minister has to integrate across, and this is not a political point, they have to integrate across what they can get through Parliament, what social scientists say. Clearly, locking down has a big impact on kids, and you're weighing, there's no good option, there's no easy option. So it's up to politicians to make those decisions. But what I can sort of, if I was transported into SAGE, my comments would be around, well, this is the consequence of this policy mathematically, that if we have 50,000 infections today in the country, that will feed forward to a certain number of deaths and a certain amount of hospitalization. And that's simply a fact. And if the virus is doubling every 10 days, by the time we run this for 3 weeks, then this is what the numbers will look like. The key thing that I think the public have grasped is that the real risk is that we burst the hospitals, that we have so many patients coming in that the hospitals will cancel all non-emergency appointments. So clearly that affects people's treatments for some diseases, chronic diseases. Not every medical emergency, not every medical problem is an emergency, but of course it can make make your life worse, and in some cases increase your chances of dying. So lockdowns are not cost-free, and that's why politicians have to make the choice. The risk of the hospitals is that you stop non-emergency care, and I've said that. The second is that you have to start triaging. And we've never reached that point in this country. And I think that's the risk that our politicians would have to face if they didn't control the spread. And the consequence of triaging is simply this, that due to breakthroughs in Oxford and other places like with dexamethasone, you've got a good chance of surviving, or a better chance of surviving COVID now than you did in March. But all that depends on you getting this world-class healthcare. If the hospitals are simply saturated with people, then doctors will simply have to make decisions about the likelihood that that treatment will benefit you, because there simply won't be enough beds or nurses to look after every single person that might be helped. And so that means some people will simply not be helped. Now, we're not at that stage, but that's clearly the biggest risk.
So what would have been the consequences if there hadn't been lockdown? Look forward a month, if there had been lockdown from Monday onwards, in terms of cases and deaths.
So there's some evidence, but it's not clear yet, that Tier 4 may have helped in London. But nationally, there's not good evidence that we controlled the spread with the tiers. So, of course, everything is provisional, and if you wait to be certain, you can wait too long. But let's assume that the virus was doubling at the same rate. Then we would reach 10,000 hospitalizations plus very quickly. Within, if we continued this for another month, then we'd see 10,000 people a day admitted to hospital without doubt.
Which would bust the hospital.
The health service can't cope with 10,000 people every day. There's no chance.
Go back a couple of weeks. What difference do you think Christmas and New Year has made to the figures?
So the UK really clamped down on Christmas, and we'll get some flavour of it, I think, by comparing the Scottish data with the London data, because they're relatively similar populations. And London, of course, people will know, had no Christmas. Tier 4 kind of stopped Christmas. Scotland allowed mixing on Christmas Day. And so it'll be interesting, and I hate to use the word interesting because I'm very aware that for people this is life and death. I don't mean it to be callous. But you'll be able to compare Scotland with London, and you might be able to see whether Christmas has had a particular effect there. The other country where there appears to be some evidence for a Christmas spike is Ireland. And so Ireland, the Republic, is undergoing quite a very rapid rise in cases at the moment, and there's some suspicion this may be due to Christmas. The data from America, where they have Thanksgiving in the end of November, I would say looked like you had an increase but not a tsunami, and you'd pushed the peak about 2 to 3 weeks out. So instead of peaking just before Thanksgiving, it didn't peak for another 2 weeks after. So it kept climbing, but what you didn't get was a massive acceleration from Thanksgiving, which I think one of the things that we feared. So I think the data on Christmas aren't clear. Based on what we see in the States, it looks like it can cause a spike or a continued increase. The data from Ireland are concerning. Data from Scotland and London don't seem to, it's too early to say whether we see a big Christmas effect.
Now, I'm a humble journalist, or a journalist anyway. Explain the biology of the new variant of COVID to me, because nobody's done that to me.
Yeah, so we're learning all the time about it. So there's always new variants of the virus. The virus is always mutating. And what happens is sometimes it throws a 6 or a double 6, and that mutation gives it an enhanced ability to spread. So if I talk about the ones that probably are most concerning, people have heard about the Kent virus. So the Kent strain has a number of mutations, one of which is, from a structural biology point of view, is kind of interesting. It's a tyrosine change. And what appears to be the case is the virus is not obviously any more or less deadly. And always important to remember that if you consider children and young people, the virus is harmless largely. But of course, in elderly and vulnerable people, it's far from harmless. So it may be the case that the virus is, that it's not under a lot of pressure to become less harmful to kids, because it's not harmful to kids. It appears to spread better in kids, the new variant from Kent. We don't know if it will spread better in adults yet, but we have good evidence now it spreads faster in young people and kids. And it appears to do so because it can generate higher viral loads in them. So I can infect you by sneezing. The more virus I sneeze out, the more likely it is you'll get infected. And so the new strain does appear to have higher loads in the nose. The other strain is one from South Africa, and that's quite a radical set of changes. So it has the similar things to Kent strain, but has additional changes. And for that reason, there's some concern about those additional changes, because those are quite radical. And those might alter your ability to target some, or at least some of your targets against the spike protein, your immune system targeting the spike. So that's in some ways a more concerning change. Clearly, the problem with the Kent virus is that it spreads so rapidly that even under the tier system, we can overwhelm the healthcare system.
And the biology of it, how did they come about? How did the original virus mutate into these two variants?
Oh, so what the virus, sorry, I should have said that. So if you think about what's happening, every time the virus makes another virus, it's like copying out a book of instructions, and the virus makes mistakes all the time when it copies, and most of those mistakes are junk. So, you go from an instruction manual to gobbledygook, or you miss out a key component. So that mutant is dead, doesn't go anywhere. But just occasionally, it makes it better. And then Darwinian selection means that if one of them is better at spreading, then you will see it rise in the population. Most of the changes will be junk. In other words, the virus just doesn't go in. That the child is in some way defective, so it doesn't spread, doesn't replicate, it's gone. Most of the time, the next most common thing to happen is it makes no difference. So the change is like changing the color, but it hasn't changed any of the function. Just occasionally, though, it makes it better at spreading. Now, normally that also comes with it becoming less lethal, but that, since the virus isn't particularly lethal in the people who it spreads the most in, that may come later. So we're just seeing something that spreads very fast.
When was the Kent virus first noticed, and what percentage of current cases are the Kent virus cases?
So I think it's now the dominant strain in London, and I think it was first seen, they'll find it, I think, quite far back, in September, August. The significance is the UK is a really good genetic surveillance. So they'll be able to dig out when this appeared. It has a particular behavior. So the famous PCR tests, with the Kent strain, you get what's called spike dropout. So when you do a PCR test, you look for 3 different parts of the virus. And it turns out that when you've got the Kent strain, you don't get the spike part of the readout. You get the other 2 proteins, but not the spike. And that's the signifier that you've got this strain.
If it was known in September, why did we take until essentially December to reveal it and to act on it?
Well, because there are no, if you sample the UK, you'll find tens, hundreds of variants. And it's only, we can't judge whether they're going, you can't tell by looking at them whether they're just the random stuff that will go nowhere, because there are lots and lots of variants of COVID in the wild now. You can only tell once it starts to spread. And you also get what's called a founder effect, which can, when you get a new suddenly strain somewhere, it can look like it's more prevalent than it really is. So it takes time to be concerned about the new strain, because you've got so many different viruses floating around, or relatives of COVID. Most of them are no different than the native. But we didn't really start to worry about this until November. And the reason people began to worry about it was they noticed that the November lockdown wasn't as effective as they had anticipated.
Now, the last 10 months have been, I hate to say this, but sort of paradise for you as a virus follower, but not for the population. I mean, how unusual is this pandemic in the way it's developed?
Sorry, John, can you just say that again? Sorry.
I'd say the last 10 months has really been, you've had a petri dish of a nation as a virus watcher. I mean, how different is this pandemic to any others? And the virus?
So, the virus behaves pretty much as you would expect any virus to behave. It's not. So the tragedy of the COVID virus is it's both, fascinating, but also rather straightforward. It works in a way that we've understood for a very long time. Binds to a certain protein on your cell, it gets inside the cell and it copies itself. And that's all it's interested in doing. What has been so desperately horrific about this is that it's capable of killing quite significant numbers of old people because it spreads so quickly. And that's what makes it unusual.
Now, earlier you said the track and trace hadn't worked. Can you explain why that is? £22 billion?
Yeah, so track and trace is a failure. Testing is really important, but track and trace relies on the Royal Society and others have estimated that you want to get at least 80% of the contacts, right, for it to be effective. And the fact is that usually at best, we were detecting less than half of the people infected with positive tests. So that's the problem. So nothing, that's the hole in the bucket. Nothing is going to fix that, because the ONS survey was showing that there were at least twice as many people infected as were actually being detected with positive tests. And so if you can't find the people who are infected, it doesn't matter what else you do in the system, it's not going to work. Track and trace only works when you've got a very small number of infections and where you've got a rigorous system set up. Once you start to take off across the country, it will fail. And that's been true in other countries. It's not just a UK failure. Chancellor Merkel pointed out that the German system had failed. The difference was she was very frank about the reasons for the failure and that it had failed. We don't really work like that here.
But £22 billion has been spent or will be spent. So is that money being essentially wasted, thrown off, bad money thrown after good?
The money that's spent on testing is really helpful. And the lateral flow tests that have come from this, some of the new technology in testing, and certainly the genomic sequencing have all been really, really important. And it's not, I can't see into how the budget splits. If you ask me, the money that has been spent on people actually phoning up and doing the contact tracing, so I don't know what proportion of the 22 billion that is, that has not been valuable.
You used the phrase "a hole in the bucket." Is there any way, if you were parachuted in, could you put your finger and repair that bucket? Do you think?
No, it can't be done. And it would be better to just say that. In my view, it would be better to say that track and trace works really well for some things, right? So food poisoning, for example, there's a huge amount of expertise, and people work in local health departments are really good at this, right? They can track and trace people who got food poisoning, or there's an outbreak of a localized outbreak, or sexually transmitted disease is another one. So these people have a huge amount of expertise, but their expertise takes time to acquire. It's a very difficult thing to do. But it's clearly different tracking people who are getting sick from food poisoning, or your sexual partners who most people can remember, than trying to track a virus that spreads through the air in large numbers. Okay.
Why did it work better if it started earlier? I mean, the deputy CMO, I think in March, said there was no point in tracking and tracing. Would we have had a different pandemic if we'd started in early March?
By then, the virus was already, I think, too well established. The only question that remains is whether or not we could have put in place an effective track and trace system when the viral numbers were very low in the summer. Could we have driven it down? Could we have closed the borders and gone for the New Zealand model or the Taiwan model? We didn't choose to do that. But there's a lot of things go into track and trace working. And one of the problems is that there's too much of a belief in British exceptionalism. On both sides, we're either the best or the worst. Other countries failed to get this to work as well. There's nothing particularly unique about Britain's failure in track and trace.
No, it has also been quite centrally controlled by PHE and by Department of Health. Might it work better if it was locally controlled by public health departments?
No, the same problem applies. That the issue with COVID is that for people that are sick with it, they have to be tested. We can usually find them now, but that wasn't always the case because we didn't know whether they're cold. People are better doing it, but people who don't have any symptoms but are still infected, how do you find them? Right? If you've got food poisoning, you'll know about it.
Yes. Moving on to sort of more positive things, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is now going into arms. Is that going to make a real difference?
Yes. So I think that's why getting the numbers under control now is so important, because all we need to do is buy some time, because if we can prevent people coming infected today, they'll get the vaccine tomorrow and therefore they'll live. So the vaccines are really great news, and I believe that we've always believed, at least I think every scientist has believed, it will halt the pandemic with vaccines. The fact that we're now vaccinating is incredibly encouraging.
Would you vaccinate at greater speed than we're doing? The Prime Minister's talking about 2 million a day. Israel has vaccinated something like, is it 15% of the population in 10 days? Yeah,
Israel has really done well. The UK is doing well, though. I think we've talked a little bit about, and I try to stay away from being political. The UK has done well in the vaccine rollout. I mean, would I like it to be faster? Absolutely. Would I like it to be 20 times faster? Yes. But it's not trivial to coordinate the logistics of handing out these vaccines, particularly the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech ones, which require a cold chain. They're much more difficult to handle than the Oxford one. So I think, the credit where credit is due, the UK has done a good job, at least in England. I think it differs between the states, but the England one I know about has done a good job in getting the vaccine out to people. Have you been vaccinated yet?
Now, were you surprised at the Pfizer one? Were you surprised at how quickly that developed by 2 Turkish immigrants in Germany, essentially?
Yeah, that's really great. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are both these new type of what we call RNA vaccines. And this is new technology that people had been working on for a long time, and it's now been proven to be effective. So I think that's exciting in the longer term, because that technology can clearly be used against other viruses. So I think, that's a real bright spot, that those vaccine technology will be used to save lives from other viruses in the future. And the same is true for the Oxford vaccine. That's also technically a really important step, because the people, and I want to stress it's not my area, but the people up there have been experts and worked on this technology for a long time, and they're going to see it make a huge difference. It's much, much cheaper than the Pfizer or Moderna technology. And so I think if we think about the global population, the Oxford vaccine is going to make a massive impact for the better.
Did you have any say at all in the development of the Oxford vaccine?
No, none at all.
Absolutely. And what difference has it made, do you think, to the reputation of Oxford University, particularly Oxford Science?
I don't know. It's hard for me to answer. Oxford has probably some of the world leading clever people here. It's one of the reasons I think. No, I wouldn't include myself in that. Far from it.
Right.
I work beside. I come into contact with really very, very clever people, and this country has been well served by them. They have made an impact. The work on dexamethasone, which has saved a lot of lives from people infected with COVID. And of course, the vaccine is going to save untold lives across the world. The ONS survey relies on some of the skills of the Oxford team around genomics and big data. And that's why we were able to spot that new variant in the UK. So Oxford, I think, has really made an important contribution to the UK here.
So you say the Oxford vaccine will save tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide?
Millions of lives.
What message have you got for anti-vaxxers?
None, really. You can't argue somebody into something that by facts. There's no basis for it. It's the same as insisting the world is flat. It's a dangerous thing. I have a more message for media outlets and social media that, we're very good at policing language around some things, but we allow dangerous crank theories to predominate that are killing people. And I wonder whether people who host these platforms feel any sense of moral responsibility for that.
So the idea that something is going into your arm and is going up to your brain is pure crank stuff, is it?
Yeah.
But there's also, sadly, a substantial sort of body of COVID deniers in this country. It's just a form of flu, why are we getting so bothered if the cure is worse than disease? Do you have a message for them?
So there is an honest debate to be had in this country as to whether the cure is worse than the disease. So I think you have to balance the effects of lockdown against the risks that we burst the hospital system. And that's why I've always said that I think it's for politicians to decide that. The trouble is that what I see is a lot of magical thinking from so-called COVID deniers who say, look at all the damage the lockdown does. And I agree with that. It does do damage. But they want to pretend or obscure the fact that not locking down will kill thousands, tens of thousands of people. And if they're willing to kill tens of thousands of people because they say it's better that tens of thousands die because the cost of locking down is, X, Y, Z for children's education, cancer, other deaths, etc. If that's their belief, then that's one you can argue with in a democracy, and that's fine. But what you can't have is to say, look at all the costs of the lockdown, it's worse than the cure, when you're not willing to actually be honest with people what the costs of not locking down are. And the costs of not locking down in terms of deaths are simply mathematical. You can calculate it pretty accurately. And the notion that if the hospital, just saying, well, it's only old people that die, it's not very nice if you're old. And most of us have elderly relatives or are elderly ourselves. And it's not been my experience that, and my own parents, for example, don't think their lives are worth living. They're very keen to see their grandchildren and do all sorts of things. And they'll take every last day they can get of good health. They don't simply want to be rubbed out with COVID. If they could have had 6 months, I'll take it. Thank you very much. So I think there's a dishonesty about that debate, and I wish that it would stop, because I think that's problematic.
But there is a fairly heavy public finance cost. I think it's up to about 300 billion has been borrowed, which is £50,000 per man, woman, and child. How are we ever going to repay that?
Agreed, right? So I think these are debates that you can have in the political sphere, but what you can't have is a debate that says, well, this is costing 300 billion, let's just let people, it'll be fine if we don't spend it. I think that's what I would say, is that you can total up the equation on both sides, and as a democracy we can make a decision what we have. But what you can't pretend, I don't deny that it's cost 300 billion, I don't deny that it's affecting children's lives, and I don't deny the lockdown will have caused some people to die before their time from loneliness or misery, or from a disruption to chronic healthcare. I don't deny any of those things. But I come back to the fact that if you don't lock down, the virus will double and you will overload the hospitals, in which case the death rate will climb much higher because people will be triaged out. Now, we can accept to do that, but what you can't pretend is that's not what's going to happen. And it would be the corollary would be if I said, we can lock down and there'll be no impact because we'll teach the kids in the summer and all be fine. That's where COVID denying gets you. And there's nothing like that in the side of the people advocating for a lockdown. They don't say there'll be no cost to kids, the money won't, don't worry about it, we'll make the money up. They recognize there's a real cost to this. But the people opposing it very rarely are honest about the cost of not locking down.
Now, this current lockdown is for 7 weeks, so the actual law says until March the 31st, I believe. How long do you expect it to continue?
Until we reach a critical mass on the vaccine.
And give us some maths on that. What are we talking about?
Depends how fast the rollout is. So Boris Johnson set a target of mid-February for the 4 highest risk groups to be vaccinated. The vaccine usually takes effect, gives you some immunity 2 weeks later. So that would suggest by early March, the people most at risk of dying will be vaccinated. Given hospitalization is more common in that cohort too, but it's not just them that get hospitalized. It would suggest that we're looking sometime in March before we can seriously consider lifting.
And those 4 tiers comprise 99% of all deaths. Is that the figure about right?
Yeah, it's about that. I think it's 90 something. But it's important to remember it's not just deaths. It's also people filling up hospital beds who would otherwise die if they were left in the street, but can be saved in hospitals. So it's not just, people who die, for every person that dies, there are maybe 5 times as many in hospital. So it's really not the case that it's a binary thing, right? People's lives are saved by getting into hospital.
So you're saying really by early March is the first time which you'll be able to see a light at the end of the tunnel?
If the vaccine rollout continues at the pace that's promised, yes.
And when are we going to see more light at the end of the tunnel? Will you and I be celebrating the streets of Jericho in June and July?
So my guess is that if the rollout continues and reaches its target, right? So if once we get to, people over 50 being vaccinated, and once you take that cohort, then I think life can return largely to normal. My own view would be the important group to vaccinate is also children in school, because it spreads like crazy in them. So if we can vaccinate young people and kids if we have enough vaccine to do then we'll cut the spread of the virus dramatically as well. But obviously they're not at risk from the virus, so you're going to prioritize those that are sickest first.
Would you vaccinate teachers?
Yes. And as I said, the people who I'm not an expert, so there are people who are much more expert in this, but just my own instinct would tell me that the last group I would vaccinate are probably 25s to 50s, because they get it, but they don't their fatalities are really low. Now, some of those will be vulnerable, so you'll catch them in your other tiers. Kids are where the virus spreads. So we now know that it spread very rapidly in school, teenage children and probably in students. So getting them vaccinated will stop the spread, because that's what we saw with the virus. The new strain is spread in that age group and then spills out into others.
So would you continue virtual teaching in universities and indeed in schools until probably at least the summer term?
I think we'll have no choice. I mean, obviously my priority would be to get children back into education as soon as I can, and safely. But the issue with kids is there's a risk to teachers, but the bigger risk is that the virus circulates in children asymptomatically. So the kids don't know they have it, and it spreads rapidly amongst them. And then it spills out into the wider community where it causes havoc. So kids would be my highest priority, and if that meant no Benidorm or skiing holidays or no pubs, then I would take that.
Just because how long did it take to eliminate polio in children by vaccination? Do you remember?
No, I don't know, but the difference is that polio tends to be a disease of childhood. So that's where you want to stop it first. The problem with COVID is it spreads in children but doesn't affect them.
Let's talk a little bit about medicine. How has the medicine of treating COVID developed in the last 10 months?
Hugely. So at all levels. So, structural biology in Oxford, we've played a small part in this, but the group of Sir David Stewart has done a lot of work on antibodies and how they tackle human antibody response, along with Professor Screeton and others. So there's been a huge amount of work in understanding the virus, and that's helping understand and lead to better understanding for vaccines. There's obviously the work of Professor Gilbert and others on the vaccine development, and then Professor Hornby's work on dexamethasone. But then there's the other things about it turns out better to lie people in the front and use forced oxygen masks. We're better at understanding the risk profile for patients. So there's been a huge amount. That's why the number of people dying has in fact decreased relative to the number of people being infected, because of medical technology. So it's made a huge difference.
So last March, if you caught COVID, and the chances were you might end up in intensive care with a tube in your neck, and then once you're in intensive care, you're 50% chance of dying. How have those figures changed?
So it used to be so that if 10 people died, now about 7 die. So it's about 70%.
The death rate has gone down by 70%, or?
Yeah, so cut by about 20 to 30% with dexamethasone. What we've discovered is that intubation isn't as helpful as people had thought, but the face mask they put over at high pressure, that definitely has made a difference too. So that's kept some people out of intensive care. But sedation and ventilation is really not as effective as people had hoped. And so that's really a last resort now, where in March that was quite common. Dexamethasone seems to be able to keep people away from that. And so definitely that's made a decrease in deaths. We also understand about blood clotting, and that's a risk, so doctors look out for that now, and so that's also helped to contribute to that reduction in deaths.
And long COVID, what effects is that going to have on people?
We don't know enough yet to know. we know that some people clearly have symptoms for months, and it's not predictable who they are, I think. So clearly some people are going to have health problems for quite a while. I think we just don't know enough to know how. It's obviously a big problem for those who have it. We don't know how many of them will really be unable to get any better after, say, a year.
But if you've been in a coma for several weeks or only several months, the chances of your body fully recovering from that are not very high, are they?
No. So people who have been intubated and sedated for prolonged periods, even if they survive, these people have a very difficult road ahead. Yes. Not all of them, but many of them.
How ready are we for the next pandemic, or indeed for the end of this pandemic?
So it won't occur like this again in this country. The Scottish people say a burnt hand teaches best. If you look at the countries that have done better with this pandemic, they got hit hard with the first SARS pandemic and the MERS pandemic, or virus. There are big risks out there in bacterial disease. There are other viruses that threaten us. I think the biggest risk is an inability to humans to evaluate proportionately risk. So it's not a scientific risk, it's a political risk.
Now, some of those societies are pretty authoritarian societies, so we're able to slam down. Is there a relationship between the rate of infection and political systems? Are we too liberal? Do we believe in too much freedom?
No, I'm not liberal. So Taiwan is a liberal democracy. New Zealand is a liberal democracy. So not everywhere is China. China has done exceptionally well, but you're right, China is an authoritarian system. But China stamped out the virus successfully, but Japan has largely kept its numbers very, very low, so is Taiwan. And New Zealand, these are all democracies. So I don't think it's a simple line. Brazil, which has a pseudo-authoritarian government, has done exceptionally badly. So it's not simple. I don't think there's an obvious line between democracy and authoritarianism, that authoritarianism is best.
If you had been advising the government all along, what might you advise them to have done differently?
Again, we come back to something I'm loath to get into because I think that shades into political advice. I think what I would have emphasized to the government is that there's a mathematical, and I'm sure this was done, I don't believe that I would have anything new to say. I think it was said by SAGE. There's a mathematical inevitability about the virus that you cannot wish away. It doesn't matter how much we believe or want it to be different. The virus is designed to spread and replicate, and it will do that. And it's simply a tragic side effect of that process that hospitalizes a certain percentage and kills a smaller percentage. And that has to be faced. It can't be wished away.
Now, move on to your own work. We've got a question from a Richard of Great Clarendon Street, who you might guess who that is. He wants to. Can you give us some technical details of some of the excellent work you've been doing on this?
Well, Richard's very kind. So it's a huge team effort. I want to say that first. I'm just one of the team. But what we've been doing is using the antibodies from camels. Now, they're different than us. And so they make a very small part of that antibody called a nanobody, and we can make that in the laboratory. So we've been making these nanobodies in the laboratory, and those nanobodies are capable of binding to the virus and inactivating it. So we've been able to show that if you add those to the virus is dead and can't infect cells anymore. And the advantage of this technology is it's very cheap. It's very new technology, so it's something we've been developing here. There are other groups around the world in the same race, but it's something I think we've had a bit of leadership in and have done very well in. So these are, they come from camels and llamas, funnily enough, but they are very tight binders. So they bind to the virus and they don't come off. And so maybe as a best analogy for those of you who have a saw, it's like putting the guard over the saw and it doesn't come off. So the saw is not going to work. So the virus is dead with these molecules, and we're really excited about trying to take these forward into the clinic, because unlike other medicines, these might be possible to give by inhalation. So you basically squirt it up your nose or sniff it rather than injections.
And how far away from going into real human beings is that?
So it will depend on the money and the excitement level. Clearly, if the disease is cured by vaccine and we never need to worry about it again, it'll be difficult to get funding to take it to phase 1. But we are hopeful we'll get through phase 1 clinical trials by June. And we have to remember that not every country will be able to deliver the vaccine, and it'll remain a problem for years to come. And we'll see new viruses emerge. So this technology, if we can prove it works here, it may be adaptable to future viruses. Well, it will be adaptable to future viruses. And maybe I'll make that point about Professor Gilbert. Professor Gilbert's work arose from the original SARS-CoV pandemic, and her team had devised this vaccine, but it was never really tested because people thought, well, we're done with SARS. It would have helped if we had finished that work then, because we would have been better prepared now. Now, it's a huge credit to her team and that they made so much progress so quickly, but I would say that they would have been even faster had they been able to deploy the vaccine that they were close to doing for SARS-CoV. Right. So I think there's an element of push technology now, so we're ready for the next thing.
Was that a funding issue? Was it the funding was withdrawn for that, or?
Well, it's a combination of funding, and in that case, it's also there was a lot of people. There was less people with the disease, so it's harder to do good clinical trials when there's not a lot of it spreading. But it's clear that her technology was ready, and so I think getting these technology. There's a lot of new technologies that will probably take another year or two to really see them. And I would advocate that we push all of them forward for the next year or two, because getting things working now will definitely speed us up for the next time.
One of the Oxford scientists, sorry.
We're not talking a lot of money.
One of the Oxford scientists said the reason it didn't take 10 years this time around to develop a vaccine, where you weren't spending all your time looking for money and getting rejected. And is that a factor in it?
Peer reviews are very, so I don't know if people know that's how we work, right? So, basically we sit around with a pen and a piece of paper and we write and ask money for ideas, and other scientists say yes or no or score it. And then we give about 10% of those ideas funding. So it's very hard to get money to do any science. It's also good because it weeds out stuff that's rubbish, but sometimes it can cause problems. So I have, as somebody who spends a lot of time writing, asking for money, I have every sympathy, but it's just that's how science works.
Back to one of my earlier questions. So the Oxford vaccine has surely made fundraising much easier for people like you with Oxford University behind your name.
I wouldn't say, most of my work comes from peer review, my funding, so that system is blind to both my name and to Oxford. It's purely on the judgment of science. I obviously hope the general public want to see money invested in science. I think having a lot of good science in this country, and clearly Oxford is a place for that, but there's others, is been really useful to this country, and I hope that the public kind of maybe realize that the UK doesn't invest very much, but it gets a lot from it. If science was an Olympic sport, we'd be right behind America in terms of gold medals. We are really good at it, and yet we spend a lot less than other countries.
And Sir John Bell, I think it was, said the other day that we seem to have got rid of factories to make vaccine, and that's now catching up with us.
Yeah,
you're having one built in Harwell.
We are. So we've learned a lot about resilience. Some things you need in your country, other things you just need really good cooperation with other countries. But where it becomes every country for themselves, then it's important that you've got something. But I'm not an advocate of North Korean style self-sufficiency. I don't think that's particularly helpful. It's not how science works. But Sir John is quite right that the UK didn't have, or until people like him said, we had lost our own vaccine manufacturing. We have that coming back at Harwell now, thanks to people like Sir John.
Now, in breaking news, yesterday there were 62,000 cases, new cases, and over 1,000 deaths. Does that surprise you?
No, it's a mathematical progression. The hope is that this is the peak in cases and that we're not vastly underestimating it, but the ONS data are not encouraging. The ONS data suggests that the infection rate is quite high, suggesting there's many more than 60,000 people being infected.
And the R rate at the moment is roughly what? And explain the R rate to people who don't understand it.
So it's a kind of strange number, and it really only is helpful when we think about population. But what it says is if I get the virus, if the R is 1, I'll infect one other person. If the R is 2, I'll infect 2 other people. So clearly, if I infect 2 people who go on to infect 2 people, I go 1, 2, 4 very quickly. So HIV is quite a high R value, but since it takes a long time for it to spread, it's not what you worry about with HIV. So what I mean is an HIV infected person is capable of spreading to multiple others. But that's because they live a long time and they're infected for a long time. COVID is a short-term virus, but in that window, then you will spread to more people. So it's a combination of time and speed.
And what's the current R rate?
So I think yesterday they estimated it about 1.5 to 2, but it varies across the country.
And it has to be less than 1 for there not to be spreading.
Yeah, mathematically, if it's above 1, it will spread. But of course, there's a difference between spreading slowly, where you're doubling every month or 6 weeks, and doubling every 10 days. And if you start doubling every 10 days, or as it was at the start of the epidemic, doubling every 3 days, then there's no chance. And so the problem with the R value, or the new variant, is that the best we ever did was get the R value down to about 0.6. And the new variant pushes that above 1 under every measure we've implemented, except complete lockdown.
It pushes up by 0.4, doesn't it, at least? Is that right?
Between 0.4 and 0.9. So
now,
it doesn't.
Coming towards the end, what's the doomsday scenario? Think what's the worst that could happen?
We're past the worst, I think. So the vaccines are going to put an end to this, and it won't get it. The next couple of weeks or 3 weeks are going to be very difficult in England, especially, and I think bits of Wales and other countries which have had a sudden surge in cases, because the hospitals are really going to struggle. Right. So I think this will be the worst time ahead of us, and there's almost nothing now we can do about it. But the lockdown means it will end. So that will stop it from the doomsday scenario. So I think we've avoided the worst, and the vaccines will end it, as we said earlier, probably towards the end of March. I would feel confident that we'll be in a new place.
And a positive message for the people of Jericho and indeed wider afield who were watching this?
I mean, I try to be positive. I think that the worst, we've avoided doomsday. I think we have a lot to be grateful for the people like Professor Gilbert, but also the people from Moderna and BioNTech with the vaccine work. And we're fortunate to live in a society that's rich enough to be able to lock down to save lives. And the science to understand how the virus spreads. If this had happened 50 years ago, for example, after the war and the austerity after the Second World War, we would have simply had to tolerate the vast loss of life. And we don't have to do that. And that's something I think we should be tremendously grateful for, that we're rich enough that, okay, we might be a little bit poorer, but we've still been able to afford to lock down, and we have to worry about the children and help their education, but we haven't had to see hundreds of thousands of people die. And that would have been the consequence if this had happened in a previous generation.
Jim, thank you very, very much indeed. One day we'll be able to have a pint in our local pub together.
Indeed.
One day,
yes.
Maybe March or April. Just for people watching, just to tell you what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Next week, local historian Mark Davis will be talking about the Jericho history, but another slice of it. He did a very interesting talk about Mount Place last time. He'll be doing more about Jericho itself. The week after that, the editor of the local paper, Pete Gavin, the new editor of the Oxford Mail and the Oxford Times, will be talking about his vision for that paper. And then the week after that, it will be the John Howson, who is a local councillor, who took with his twin brother a trip around Europe last summer and by train, twin tracks. He's going to talk about trains. Now, if you want to find out more, just go to the website. It's a brand new website called myjericho.co.uk. That will tell you exactly what is on and when and how to join it. And also, these things cost a little bit of money. You used to have to pay £2. Now there's various technical costs involved. So if you're feeling generous, perhaps you'd like to help to crowdfund it. The details are on the screen now. Any money deposited in that bank account will go towards more and better of these. So it's Lloyds Bank, 139626, account number 485184660, Jericho Good Works, and that'll be on the My Jericho website as well. So please try and join us every Wednesday at 5:30, and it's all on YouTube, so you don't have to, if you miss it, you can catch it. But thank you very much, and well, let's end as we began with some nice pictures of old Jericho as it was.
Yeah.